Hi guys, welcome back. Today's story is about a captive nurse who must save a dying crime lord, but survival demands a dark, dangerous bond that changes everything.
The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Memorial buzzed their usual death rattle, casting that sickly green pallor over everything: the linoleum floors, the slumped forms of waiting families, the face of Grace Miller as she stared at the chart in her hands. She had been on her feet for 14 hours, her back a knot of dull pain, her mind running on the fumes of cheap coffee and grim determination. The hospital was a machine that chewed up compassion and spat out exhaustion, but Grace had long since stopped expecting it to be anything else. She worked because the debt collector's letters were piling up in her apartment, each one a fresh wound, each figure a reminder of the cost of her mother's final months. There was no room for self-pity in her life, only the next patient, the next needle, the next dose of medication. The call came at 11:47 p.m., just as she was signing off on a discharge. The phone buzzed in her pocket, and the name on the screen made her blood run cold. Leo. Her brother. The one person she had left in this world, the one bright spot in the gray sludge of her existence. She answered, and his voice came through in a panicked whisper that didn't sound like him at all. He was scared, truly scared, and he was trying to tell her something about men in the hallway, men who didn't belong, men who had been watching the building for days. The line crackled, and she heard a crash on his end, the sound of furniture overturning, a muffled cry that tore through her like a blade. Then silence. Dead air. The call disconnected, and Grace stood frozen in the middle of the corridor, the chart slipping from her fingers and scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. She didn't remember leaving the hospital. She didn't remember the taxi ride, or the way her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys to her building. What she remembered was the sight of her apartment door hanging open, the frame splintered, the lock shattered. She remembered stepping inside and finding her world turned upside down. Drawers yanked from their tracks, couch cushions gutted, the contents of her mother's old jewelry box scattered across the floor like worthless trinkets. And there, on the kitchen counter where she always left her coffee mug, was a single sheet of paper with an address written in a precise, unfamiliar hand. No explanation. No threat. Just the address, and the understanding that Leo was gone. She didn't call the police. Something in her gut told her that was a useless gesture, that the men who had taken her brother operated in a world where uniforms meant nothing and badges were just ornaments. So she went. She took a cab to the address, a tower of glass and steel that stabbed the night sky like a monument to wealth and power. The lobby was marble and gold, hushed and sterile, and the two men who met her at the door were cut from the same cloth, broad-shouldered, expressionless, wearing suits that cost more than she made in a year. They didn't ask questions. They didn't apologize. One of them simply said, "Mr. Blackwood requires your services. Your brother's safety depends on your cooperation," and then a blindfold was pressed over her eyes, and she was guided into an elevator that hummed with the quiet authority of immense wealth. The ride felt endless, the kind of silence that presses against the ears and makes every heartbeat sound like thunder. When the blindfold finally came off, she was standing in a penthouse that defied logic, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the city's glittering veins, furniture that looked more like sculpture than seating, a fireplace large enough to roast a whole pig. But Grace didn't have eyes for any of it. Her gaze was pulled to the man in the center of the room, seated in a high-backed chair like a king on a throne, wrapped in a robe of dark silk that did nothing to hide his gaunt frame. Damian Blackwood was a study in contradictions. His face was a masterpiece of sharp angles and aristocratic features, the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers or wanted posters, depending on the angle. But beneath the surface beauty, something was terribly wrong. His skin had the pallor of old bone, his eyes sunken and rimmed with shadow, his hands clasped on the arms of his chair with a grip that betrayed a desperate effort to conceal his weakness. He was dying. Grace, with her years of nursing experience, could see it in the tremor of his fingers, the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the sheen of fever sweat on his brow. And yet, for all his frailty, there was nothing weak about him. His eyes, dark as winter stone, fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to step back. He didn't ask. He commanded. His voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime being obeyed, and he laid out the terms of her existence with brutal clarity. He had a rare autoimmune disease, a predator that was eating him from the inside out, and his army of specialists had failed him. He had found Grace's file, buried deep in the hospital's archives, and he had seen the work she did on patients others had given up on. He didn't believe in miracles, he told her. He believed in results. She would save his life, or she would never see her brother again. Her mother's debt would be erased, Leo would be returned to her unharmed, and she would walk away from this penthouse with a clean slate. Refuse, and the blood would be on her hands. Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her, the weight of his words pressing down like a physical force. Her mother's medical bills were a mountain she had spent years trying to scale. Leo was her heart, her reason for getting up in the morning. And here, in this gilded cage, a dying man was offering her salvation in exchange for her soul. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was a monster, that she would find another way. But she looked into his cold, unyielding eyes, and she saw the truth there. He was not a man who made threats lightly. He was not a man who ever lost. She had no army, no power, no leverage. All she had was her skill, her nerve, and a desperate, furious love for her brother. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I'll do it," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "But if you hurt him, if there's a single mark on him, I will find a way to end you. You can be sure of that." A flicker of something, respect, maybe, or amusement, crossed Damien Blackwood's gaunt features. He inclined his head, a gesture that might have been a nod of acknowledgement or a dismissal, Grace couldn't tell. The man who had brought her stepped forward, guiding her toward a door that led to a private suite, a room that would become her prison and her battlefield. As she walked, she cast one last glance over her shoulder at the man in the chair, the man who held her brother's fate in his hands, and she made a silent vow. She would save him. Not for his sake, but for hers. She would keep Leo alive, keep herself alive, and when it was all over, she would walk out of this nightmare and never look back. But even as the door closed behind her, a small, treacherous part of her mind whispered that she was lying to herself. That the man with the dying body and the unyielding eyes had already begun to sink his claws into her. And in the darkness of her new room, surrounded by luxury that felt like a cage, Grace Miller began to realize that the price of survival might be higher than she was willing to pay. Days bled into one another inside the penthouse. Grace learned the rhythm of the place, the soft hum of medical monitors, the hushed footsteps of staff who moved like ghosts, the perpetual twilight of drawn curtains that kept Damien's fragile body from the harshness of daylight. She worked with clinical precision, administering treatments that required steady hands and a steel spine, all while the weight of Leo's absence pressed against her chest like a stone. Damien watched her constantly. His gaze followed her across rooms, tracked her movements during examinations, studied her face for cracks in her composure. He was a man who trusted nothing and no one, and Grace felt the heat of his suspicion like a brand. The penthouse was a fortress, but fortresses have snakes. Victor Stone introduced himself as Damien's second-in-command, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. He was handsome in a polished, predatory way, his suits immaculate, his words silk-covered knives. He brought her coffee, asked about her family, offered to help with the heavier medical supplies. At first, Grace thought he was simply being courteous, perhaps even kind. But then the questions began. How was Damien responding to the treatment? Was he sleeping through the night? Had he mentioned any plans for the coming weeks? Victor's inquiries were casual, almost offhand, but Grace had spent years reading people in pain, and she recognized the hunger beneath his pleasant demeanor. He wasn't curious about Damien's health. He was calculating its decline. The tension in the penthouse tightened like a wire pulled too taut. Grace found herself caught between two men who circled each other like wolves, both pretending the other didn't exist. Damien, for his part, grew more possessive with each passing day. He demanded she attend to him personally, refusing the other nurses who rotated through the suite. His commands were clipped and cold, but there was something else lurking beneath his words, a territorial instinct that bristled whenever Victor lingered too long in Grace's presence. On one occasion, Damien caught Victor's hand resting on Grace's shoulder, a gesture meant to appear friendly, and the temperature in the room dropped to freezing. Damien said nothing. He simply stared, and Victor withdrew his hand as though burned. Grace began to dream of Leo, nightmares of his frightened face, his desperate voice on the phone. She woke each morning with her heart pounding, the phantom echo of the crash still ringing in her ears. She had no way of knowing if he was safe, no way to verify Damien's promises. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. And yet, as the days wore on, she found herself studying Damien with a different kind of attention. She noticed the way his jaw tightened when he was in pain, the way he refused to show weakness even when his body betrayed him, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, a look that was equal parts hunger and wariness. He was a man who had built his empire on fear, and now fear was eating him alive. Victor approached her in the library one evening, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He told her that Damien was not what he seemed, that the empire was built on blood and broken bones, that her loyalty to a dying monster was misplaced. He painted a picture of a new world, one where Damien's reign ended and a more reasonable man took the throne. He offered her a role in that world, a position of safety and reward. Grace listened, her face impassive, her heart racing. She understood now that she was standing on the edge of a knife. One false move, one misplaced word, and she would fall into the abyss. She gave Victor nothing, offered him no promises, but she also did not refuse him. She simply nodded, thanked him for his concern, and walked away with her hands trembling at her sides. That night, as she adjusted the fore drip in Damien's room, he caught her wrist with surprising strength. His grip was cold and fierce, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "You're afraid," he said. It wasn't a question. Good. Fear keeps you alive. Grace stared at him, her pulse hammering against his fingers. She wanted to pull away, to tell him she was afraid of him, of Victor, of every shadow in this gilded hell. But instead, she met his gaze and held it. "I'm not afraid of you," she lied. "I'm afraid of what I'll become if I stay here too long." Something flickered in Damien's expression, a crack in his armor that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He released her wrist and turned his face to the ceiling, dismissing her without another word. But Grace knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that something had shifted between them. The viper was coiled in the nest, and the monster was watching her with eyes that saw too much. Hope was a dangerous thing in a place like this. Grace had learned that lesson in the hospital, watching families cling to impossible dreams while their loved ones slipped away. But now, against all odds, the treatment was working. Damien's numbers were improving, his fever receding, the angry inflammation in his joints quieting to a dull ache. He was still weak, still pale, but there was a flicker of life in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a spark that made Grace's chest tighten with something she refused to name. She documented his progress with clinical detachment, but her hands betrayed her. They moved faster, steadier, driven by a desperate hope that if she could save him, she could save Leo too. Victor watched the improvement with barely concealed fury. His smiles grew thinner, his questions sharper, his patience fraying at the edges. Grace felt his gaze on her constantly, a predator calculating its next move. She knew he was running out of time, that Damien's recovery meant the end of Victor's ambitions, and she knew what desperate men were capable of. She began sleeping with a metal pen under her pillow, a pathetic weapon against a man like Victor, but it was all she had. The penthouse, once a prison of gilded silence, now hummed with a tension so thick she could taste it. Every shadow held a threat, every footstep in the hallway made her heart lurch. The confrontation came in her private quarters, a sleek room that felt more like a hotel suite than a cell. Victor entered without knocking, his demeanor shifting from friendly advisor to something far more menacing. He closed the door behind him, and Grace felt the trap snap shut. His voice was soft, almost gentle, as he laid out the terms of her survival. He had a plan, he explained, a way to make Damien's decline look natural, a slow deterioration that would fool even the best doctors. All she had to do was adjust the dosages, make small changes that would accumulate over time. If she cooperated, Leo would be released and given a new identity, safe and far away. If she refused, Victor would frame her for attempting to poison Damien, and both she and her brother would pay the price. Grace listened with a stillness that surprised even her. Her mind raced through calculations, weighing options, searching for an escape that didn't exist. She was trapped between two monsters, and both of them wanted to use her as a weapon against the other. But Grace had never been the kind of woman to accept her fate quietly. She had spent years fighting for her mother's life, fighting against debt collectors and hospital administrators and a system that ground the poor into dust. She had learned that sometimes the only way out was through, and sometimes the only way to win was to play a game with no rules. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She would not help Victor. She would not betray Damien. But she also would not let Victor destroy her. That night, she went to Damien's room and told him a carefully constructed lie. She told him about the tampering she suspected, the subtle changes in the medication that made no sense, the shadow of a traitor moving through his house. She did not name Victor. She didn't need to. Damien's expression shifted from skepticism to cold, murderous understanding. He knew. He had always known. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that his trusted second-in-command was actively working against him, unleashed something terrifying in the dying man. His eyes turned to ice, his voice dropping to a register that made Grace's blood run cold. "You will help me," he said, and it was not a request. He reached for her, his fingers wrapping around her wrist with a grip that held no weakness, only the fierce determination of a cornered animal. "You will stay close to me. You will be my shield, my witness, my proof. I will not let him take what is mine." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to scream that she was not his property, that she had not signed up to be a pawn in his bloody games. But she looked into his eyes, and she saw something that made her pause. Beneath the rage, beneath the cold calculation, there was fear. Damian Blackwood, the king of the underworld, was afraid. Afraid of Victor, afraid of his own failing body, afraid of the one thing he had never been able to control: death. She did not pull away from his grip. She let him hold her, let him anchor himself to her presence, and she felt the terrifying intimacy of the moment settle over her like a shroud. She was no longer just a nurse. She was his confidant, his partner in this dark alliance. The lines that had once been clear were now hopelessly blurred. She was saving him, yes, but she was also becoming something else, a part of his world, a witness to his ruthlessness, a keeper of his secrets. And as he finally released her wrist, his fingers trailing across her skin with a tenderness that made no sense, Grace realized that the bargain she had struck was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She was not just saving his life. She was binding herself to him, and there was no way out. The penthouse became a stage, and Grace learned to perform. She played the devoted nurse, the trusted confidant, the woman who had inexplicably earned the favor of the dying king. She stood close to Damian during his meetings, her hand resting on his shoulder as though steadying him, when in truth she was reading the room for threats. She laughed at his dark jokes, met his cold gaze without flinching, and let the other staff members whisper about her sudden rise in status. Victor watched her with narrowed eyes, his frustration mounting with each passing day. His plan was crumbling, and he knew Grace was the architect of its ruin. The mask of civility between them had slipped entirely, replaced by a silent war of glances and veiled threats. Damian, for his part, played his role with chilling precision. He allowed Victor to believe he was growing weaker, that the treatment was failing, that the empire was finally within reach. He leaned on Grace's arm during walks through the penthouse, his weight a calculated performance of frailty. But in private, behind closed doors, he was all sharp edges and commanding presence. He reviewed intelligence reports, issued orders to his loyal men, and dismantled Victor's network piece by piece. Grace watched him work with a mixture of horror and admiration. He was a predator even in his sickness, and Victor was walking into a trap with his eyes wide open. The trap snapped shut on a night of violent storms, the city outside the windows lashed by rain and wind. Victor made his move, cornering Grace in the medical suite with two of his men. His voice was no longer smooth. It was raw, desperate, the voice of a man who had gambled everything and lost. He grabbed Grace's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, and demanded she come with him. He would use her as leverage, he said, a bargaining chip to force Damian's hand. But before Grace could scream, before she could fight, the doors burst open and Damian's men flooded the room. They moved like shadows, swift and silent, disarming Victor's men before they could draw their weapons. And then Damian entered. He walked without a cane, without assistance, his posture straight and his eyes blazing with cold triumph. The sickness that had hollowed him out was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but in that moment he was every inch the ruthless King Victor had tried to overthrow. He looked at his former second-in-command with something close to pity, and then he gave the order. Victor was dragged away, his protest swallowed by the howling wind outside. Grace stood frozen, her arms still aching from Victor's grip, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had been the bait. She had been the trap. And Damian had used her without a second thought. Later, in the quiet of his private study, Damian revealed the full scope of his plan. He had known about Victor's treachery from the beginning, had allowed it to fester so he could identify every player in the conspiracy. He had tracked Leo's location from the moment Grace entered the penthouse, had men watching her brother's captors at all times. Leo was safe, Damian told her. He had been released hours ago, given a new identity and a substantial sum of money. He was already on a plane to a place where Victor's remaining allies would never find him. Grace should have felt relief. She should have felt gratitude. Instead, she felt fury. He had used her. He had manipulated her. He had made her a pawn in his bloody game, and now he expected her to thank him. But even as the anger burned through her, Grace felt something else stirring beneath the surface. She was free. Leo was safe. The threat was gone. She could walk out of this penthouse and never look back. Yet the thought of leaving made her chest constrict with an unfamiliar ache. She looked at Damian, standing by the window with the storm raging behind him, his face illuminated by flashes of lightning. He was still a monster. He would always be a monster. But he was also the man who had kept his word, the man who had saved her brother, the man who had trusted her with his life. The dangerous game was over, but Grace realized with dawning horror that she was no longer sure she wanted to stop playing. The penthouse felt different now. The tension that had coiled through every corridor, every shadow, every whispered conversation, had evaporated like morning mist. Victor was gone, his network dismantled, his ambitions reduced to ash. Leo was safe, tucked away in a quiet corner of the world where no one would find him, his future secured by the very man Grace had once sworn to despise. The threat was over. The cage was open. And Grace Miller stood at the threshold of freedom with her bags packed and her heart a battlefield. She had told herself she would leave. She had repeated it like a prayer, like a lifeline, through every sleepless night and every tense moment in Damien's presence. This was not her world. These were not her people. The man who had enslaved her, manipulated her, used her as a pawn in his bloody games, was not someone she could love. He was a monster, and monsters did not get happy endings. She had saved his life, and he had paid his debt. The transaction was complete. There was nothing left to keep her here. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Grace remembered the way his fingers had trembled against her wrist in the darkest hours of his sickness. She remembered the vulnerability in his eyes when he had looked at her and seen not a tool, but a woman. She remembered the fierce, possessive way he had shielded her from Victor, the cold fury in his voice when he had threatened anyone who dared to harm her. She remembered the moments when the mask had slipped, when she had glimpsed the man beneath the monster, a man who had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Damien found her in the library, standing by the window with her suitcase at her feet. The morning light streamed through the glass, casting long shadows across the floor, and he looked almost human in its golden glow. The sickness had receded, leaving behind a man who was still sharp-edged and intimidating, but no longer teetering on the brink of death. He was dressed in a dark suit, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He did not ask her to stay. He did not beg or plead or make demands. He simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, and told her the truth. He told her that he had built his empire on fear and blood, that he had never known kindness except as a weakness to be exploited. He told her that she had seen him at his worst, had witnessed his fragility and his cruelty, and had not flinched. He told her that he had never needed anyone, had never wanted anyone, until her. The words came out rough and unpracticed, the confession of a man who had spent his life hiding behind walls of ice. He was not asking for her forgiveness. He was not asking for her love. He was simply telling her that she had become essential to him, that the thought of her walking out that door was worse than any illness he had ever faced. Grace listened with her heart in her throat. She had dreamed of this moment, of the freedom she had fought so hard to reclaim. But freedom, she realized, was not the absence of chains. It was the ability to choose. And standing in that sunlit room, with the man who had terrified her and saved her and consumed her, Grace made her choice. She let go of the suitcase. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and she placed her hand over his heart. She could feel it beating beneath her palm, strong and steady, a rhythm that had become as familiar to her as her own. She did not tell him she loved him. The word was too small, too fragile, too insufficient for the gravity of what she felt. Instead, she told him that she would stay. That she would stand beside him in the darkness, that she would fight his enemies and tend his wounds and remind him, every single day, that he was more than the sum of his sins. She told him that the debt he owed her was not one of money or power, but of something far more dangerous. He owed her his humanity, and she would collect it in full. Damien Blackwood, the king of the underworld, the man who had never bowed to anyone, lowered his head and pressed his forehead to hers. His breath was warm against her lips, his hands coming up to frame her face with a tenderness that belied his brutal reputation. He did not thank her. He did not make promises he could not keep. He simply held her, and in that silence, Grace understood that she had found something she had never expected. A purpose. A partner. A man who would burn the world down to keep her safe. Outside the windows, the city roared on, oblivious to the transformation taking place in the penthouse. But inside, in the quiet space between two hearts, a new world was being born. Grace had walked into this fortress as a captive, bound by fear and desperation. She would walk out again someday, but she would walk out as a queen. The debt of the heart had been paid in full, and the weight of it was not a burden. It was a crown.
And that's the end of the story. I hope you loved it and enjoyed it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment down below in the comment section. Turn on your notification button. And as always, stay dangerous.